Welcome back. To kick things off, we will create a default weather service as our first microservice. Why a weather service though? Well, it's simple yet effective for understanding the basics of microservices and API gateway. With this weather service, we will explore concepts like gateway reverse proxy, rate limiting, restricts access middleware, response caching, load balancing, and logging. Once we have nailed those fundamentals, we'll move on to the other core services, starting with the identity service and gradually expanding our platform. This way, we will start simple, make learning easy, and progressively add complexity as we grow. Alright, let's get started. Okay, let's start by creating a blank solution. We'll name our project as Social Hub. To keep our project organized, we'll create three main directories: the API gateways, services, and shared. This approach will keep our project scalable and well organized as we add more microservices. Alright, let's create our directories. The first one is the API gateways. Now let's create another directory. We'll name it as services. Here all our microservices will go in. And let's add another folder. We'll name it shared. All the common logics will go in there. Alright, with that, our folder structure is ready. Let's move on to our first microservice, the weather service. First, inside the services folder, let's create a new folder named weather services or weather service. Now let's create a new ASP.NET Core Web API project. Hit next. We'll name it as the weather API. Let's make sure that we put it in the correct path. So we'll be putting it under the services folder and the weather service folder. Let's check our path and let's hit next. Let's keep the setting at default for now and hit create. Let's give it a moment to create the project. Alright, now let's configure the launch settings. Okay, so we are going to set the HTTP port to 3011 and the HTTPS port would be 5011. With that configured, let's navigate to our weather forecast controller. Alright, so I'm going to remove the action verb from the route, so we can just use /weather forecast. This makes our route cleaner and more restful. Let's add /API/v1 to the route for better versioning and organization. Alright, now that we have set up our weather service, let's build it. Great, the build was successful. Now let's run the application. Alright, let's see the application is running on 5011 for HTTPS. Let's copy that and let's test our endpoint using Postman. Let's create a new GET request to our weather service endpoint. Alright, so there it is. We have got a successful response with the weather data. Alright, now that we have tested our weather service, I'll stop the running project. Next, let's create a new empty ASP.NET Core project for our API gateway. Alright, let's name it socialhub.yarp API Gateway. Alright, let's make sure that we put it in the right directory. And then hit next. Let's enable the Docker support. I believe we need that. Let's wait for it to get created, and here we go. Let's configure the launch settings. We'll use port 3000 for HTTP and 5000 for secure HTTP. Now let's just add the YARP API NuGet package to our API Gateway project. Let's install it. Alright, I'll make sure to write clean and modular code. To do this, let's create a folder named configurations. Inside this folder, we'll add two classes, the route configuration and the cluster configuration. Let's start with cluster configuration. Alright, so we'll make this class as a static class and we'll define a static method. Let's name it get clusters. Alright, so this method will return a list of clusters or an array of clusters. So for now we have a single cluster called, and we'll name it. Alright, so just name it as weather cluster. And add a destination pointing to our weather service. We will be using HTTP port to consume our downstream service over HTTP from the API gateway. So the address for our HTTP port is 3011. Let's just configure it. All right, next let's create the route configuration class. In this we are going to do the same thing. We'll just make it as a static and we'll return a static method. Let's name it get routes, and that's going to return the array of routes. All right, so let's define the route config. We have a route named like weather route, and let's add our cluster, the weather cluster. Make sure you just name it and spell it correctly. Let's add the route matches property and let's define the path for it. So we'll define it as /weather service, and whatever path, let's just catch all the paths for the weather service. All right, with that done, let's navigate to our program.cs file. And let's add the service for our reverse proxy. Since we have defined the configurations in memory, we'll load it directly from the memory. I prefer adding an underscore as my variable prefix. All right, let's just call the add reverse proxy method. And let's just load it from memory and pass in our route and cluster configurations. Route configurations dot get routes and cluster configurations dot get clusters. Oops, we mixed the brackets. It's showing the error. Let's fix it. All right, now let's add the map reverse proxy method to wire up the reverse proxy middleware in the request pipeline. All right, now let's configure the startup project. We'll need both the projects as our starter project, so we'll just start it and set it up as a new profile. Okay, and let's just start the project. Okay, so before testing our API gateway, let's just test our weather service first. All right, it's worked fine. Now let's try it through the API gateway. And oh, we get an error. Let's look into the gateway. So the response says 3 or 7, and I see that it's showing 3 or 7. This means the gateway is trying to call the service via HTTP, and the weather service is redirecting it over to the secure HTTP. All right, let's go to the program.cs file. Oh, no, that's not this. The program.cs file. And let's remove the secure HTTP redirection middleware. I'll just comment it out. All right, let's try again. So we still see this error. All right, so this time it's the different error. All right, let's scan through our code and see what we miss. Let's go to our route and cluster configuration. Make sure you name it correctly and you spell it correctly. That could be the problem. Let's dive into the route configuration and see what's going on. The cluster looks good. The route has, okay, now I'm seeing it because we missed the transformation part to match the route patterns properly. So let's go ahead and add this. Let's define our path pattern to call and catch all the patterns. It's simple. You just define it with double strikes and write catch all. And now let's try again. All right. Let's hit it again. And there we go. It worked. The API gateway is now routing the request to the weather service as expected. Now that everything is working fine, let's summarize what we have done. We started by setting up the project structure and creating our first microservice, the weather service. We tested it to ensure it worked correctly. Then we created the API gateway using YARP and then configured it with routes and clusters and tested our weather service via gateway. So in the next part, we'll secure our microservice with access restrictions and core setup. Before that, we will clean up our code and make it more modular. Okay, so if you found this helpful, please like, share, and subscribe, and share your feedback. Stay tuned for the next part.